what do you make of this transition of choosing one and then the other as the possible king for the future?
Well, I think that Saudi Arabia, and particularly King Salman, are trying to make a big change in the policy. Saudi Arabia has traditionally been governed by a gerontocracy, ruled by a collection of princes in their 70s and 80s. So I think this is an attempt to get ahead of demographic curves and position Saudi Arabia for the 21st century.
Position Saudi Arabia for the 21st century. What kind of Saudi Arabia would that be, Mr. Lee? This young prince is well known for being aggressive and tough. And also, he is very much publicized in the media almost every day. So what kind of leadership are we seeing this choice by the king?
I think, so far, the junior and Salman, I mean, the crown prince, he seemed to be very ambitious. And it got a sort of vision, which is called 2030 vision for the Saudians. And he also introduced some of the reforms. And also, I think, he tried to promote some of the things which are very much enjoyed by the young people.
Like what?
For example, he introduced sort of Western sort of entertainment and also, calling for the rights for the women and this kind of social reforms. But ever since he introduced this kind of reform so far, where people have not seen any visible progress yet. And he also has been called by his critics is very impulsive, reckless, but he is also, and called by his supporters, he is very energetic, very determined, and he can make a kind of decision.
A lot of adjectives over there. What we need to have is more verb, probably. So, Mr. Blank, let me ask you. I mean, this crown prince is well known for having argued for, at least, a bigger role for women in the economic life. He's also very active in terms of what Mr. Lee just earlier talked about, the so-called Western lifestyle. But at the same time, he talked about Saudi Arabia should get rid of the dependence totally on oil. He also talked about very strong role of Saudi Arabia in the region. Even some suggest he was one of those behind the wars in Yemen. So analyzing all of this, what kind of Saudi Arabia do you think now the current king is trying to cut out with this choice of this crown prince?
I don't think that King Salman actually knows what Saudi Arabia is going to be like in the future. Let's remember that King Salman is in his 80s.
Right.
I think that he recognizes, however, that the old model, that is reliant almost entirely on an oil-based economy and resting on a bargain with the conservative and very traditionalist clergy to keep the royal family in power, I think he realizes that this bargain in this model is not going to be successful in the 21st century. Qatar and the UAE have already moved, or are in the process of moving, to a new model that is more internationalist, more open to other outside influences, while still maintaining absolute control by the ruling houses and dynasties. That, I think, is what King Salman wants to get to, but I don't think he has a very clear picture of how to do it.
Right. Mr. Lee, from your perspective, we have seen some very dramatic movements in the region, the Gulf countries, over the past few weeks. On the one hand, there's a different choice of the crown prince in Saudi Arabia, which is a big thing, of course, for the region, because it's about the future. On the other hand, there's also some current geopolitical struggle among the countries in the Gulf region. For example, Saudi Arabia, together with UAE, vis-a-vis, let's just say, Qatar. And today, the news came out suggesting there has been a list of demands coming from Saudi Arabia, UAE, toward Qatar if the latter wants to mend the fences with the former, including severe tie with Iran, get rid of military bases in Qatar by Turkey, and also there's also talk about should be getting rid of the media organization, Al Jazeera. Of course, different sides say different things about these leaks, but it seems that most of them have been true. So, Mr. Li, it's a long question, but I want to ask you, how do you read all of these moves all at the same time, very much close to one another? This is relatively a quiet place in terms of countries toward one another, but now you see so much movement just within a couple of weeks.
I think this is largely, as many even the UAE foreign minister has admitted, and because they have got the encouragement from U.S. President Donald Trump's Middle East visit, and those peoples and encouraged by the Trump to take the actions, try to first to form a kind of anti-Iran coalition. Then they would take sort of actions to try to eliminate or to reduce the influence of Iran.
Right.
And they believe that for them this is historical opportunities because during the last 80 years, because Obama's the attitudes for Iran, they could not do it. But Trump coming, Trump is in the line
right.
of Saudis.
Is that really a window opportunity? People have a far different worldview, some say, particularly if you compare the last U.S. president and the current one, Barack Obama, for example, and Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump's strong public endorsement of Riyadh as his primary regional partner may have emboldened the Saudis, some say, and changed some of the geopolitical math. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf nations like the United Arab Emirates were deeply suspicious of Obama's diplomatic détente with Iran, which culminated in the year 2015 nuclear deal. Of course, those a comparison, but the question is, Mr. Blank, U.S. as the power in the world, particularly in the Middle East, has to play its balance very well. Do you think President Trump, with his last trip made to Saudi Arabia, has managed to do that, or actually giving wrong messages, or at least exaggerated messages to those in the region?
Well, I think that there are a lot of mixed messages coming out of Washington. The administration is just getting its sea legs right now. And I think that there is a lot of concern in the region about what is the U.S. position going to be vis-a-vis Iran. Will there be a wholesale change of policy? Will there be a renunciation of the nuclear deal? If there is no renunciation of the nuclear deal, will there be a rethink of the U.S. policy towards ISIS? Which is, of course, the sworn enemy of Iran and also the sworn enemy of the United States. Saudi Arabia is trying, I believe, to leverage this uncertainty for its own policy goals, which, as you quite rightly point out, are lining up a Muslim alliance against Iran. And from Saudi Arabia's perspective, it would very much like this to be a Sunni alliance versus Shia Iran.
Mr. Blank, I want to go a little bit further. I mean, all of us have heard and read and watched the information related to what happened during the September 11th terrorist attack and who were behind them, those terrorists in the incident. And there have been, as a result of that, quite a cold period between the United States and Saudi Arabia, reflected during the Obama administration. So now, how well and seriously has the U.S. done its research about who to deal with and who to work with in order to tackle ISIS and also the root causes of terrorism, or at least some of the root causes of terrorism?
Well, I think the U.S. has certainly done an extensive amount of research. We at RAND do nothing but research, and many of our colleagues throughout the country and throughout the academic establishment have looked at exactly this question. But it's a very, very complex issue because Saudi Arabia has been not only one of the prime partners of the U.S., but also a partner of groups that are not necessarily friendly to the U.S. And a lot of the root causes that fueled not only 9/11, the rise of al-Qaeda, the rise of ISIS, but the Arab Spring, which was a peaceful expression of some of the same discontents. These same frustrations have expression throughout the region, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in UAE, in Egypt, and in many other countries. What we do with that, the United States, China, Saudi Arabia, that is a much longer and more difficult question.
Interesting. Mr. Lee, your input here?
I think, if we, take, what Trump said during his campaign, and actually, he is not so friendly. And I would say that he was criticizing the Saudi, the policies, especially, its position on the anti-terrorism. And this is what I would say that the achievements of the Saudi Arabians. After Trump, they became the U.S. president, they, Saudians, successfully, changed, Trump's position instead of, very, anti-Saudi, not to become, a Saudi very close alliance. Some people say that, more than, $100 billion US may, have sort of effect which, help the Saudians to change, Trump's position. Yes, I think a part of that. But still, I believe, Saudi and the US, they share the same goals. For example, the the Iranians, they also try to, diminish the influence of Iranian in the world.
Right.
I think this is a very important, the common position of the two sides.
But as we know, Mr. Lee and some of the other gentlemen joining us right now, priorities of countries change when things happen. So let me go to in Doha, Ibrahim Farhat, who is a conflict resolution professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Mr. Farhat, welcome to our program. I want to have your views about whether it's likely to be sustainable for Trump administration this time, at least at the very beginning of it, to have its continued or even better relations with Saudi Arabia to begin with. Is it likely to be sustainable, given the priorities that the U.S. might be dealing with in the near future?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. I highly doubt that this relationship is sustainable. We are seeing that the relationship is struggling from day one with the first crisis that's erupting in the region. We have seen a clear division within the U.S. administration between the establishment that more in support with the traditional position of allying with their traditional or supporting their traditional allies, in this case not only Saudi Arabia and the UAE but Qatar as well. And on the other hand, we are seeing that the Trump administration more signaling towards the Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So this clear division has been sustained. That's the only sustainable thing that we're seeing. And it's not the only division actually within the US administration and the establishment, because we have seen before actually the division within the judicial system and the Trump administration, where when the Trump started the ban against Muslims, the judiciary opposed that decision, and the struggle is continuing on that level. So we are seeing another battle between the White House and the establishment in the United States, now this time over the crisis in the Gulf and the support to Saudi Arabia from the White House, while the establishment is opposing this. I think this whole relation, yes.
So, Mr. Farhat, are you suggesting that the internal politics in Washington might be spilling over to the overall strategy that the Trump administration might be having in the Middle East. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, actually, I think the internal politics are key here, and it's not actually it's making the situation worse because there is an absence of a U.S. role, an absence of a clear U.S. role in this crisis that should actually be pushing to peacefully end the crisis rather than exacerbating the crisis.
Right, Mr. Blank.
Actually, I think that the crisis.
Mr. Blank, if I could go to you, which is, there has been so-called America First. There's also talk about whether Trump administration is about American isolationism, and there has been too much role U.S. played in the Middle East, and now it's probably too little role. Whether you're coming from whichever camp, there seems to be a debate going on about what is likely to be the future of the United States and the Middle East, particularly, Mr. Blank, the shale gas. You have developed that technology in the U.S., making sure you're not going to be anymore that much dependent on the Middle East for the natural resources and oil. So what would all of this mean?
Well, good question. The U.S. has been trying to disengage from a lot of the quarrels in the Middle East for some time. President Obama tried what was first called a pivot to Asia, then a rebalance to Asia. The current administration talks about America first and pulling back from commitments, and yet when one is a superpower, one really has very little choice but to stay engaged. Mr. Farhad is absolutely right that the U.S. should, in my view at least, be trying to resolve this dispute between its partners, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, rather than simply standing back and letting a very dangerous situation become even more perilous.
When you say U.S. should step in, which side to step in and do what? Do you think the Trump administration is going to follow your advice?
Well, I
Mr.
don't
Blank?
think the U.S. should take sides in this. I don't think the U.S. should take sides. I think the U.S. should simply use its offices as a friend of both nations to bring about a peaceful resolution. If the U.S. were to side with either Saudi Arabia or Qatar, it would be, I think, very bad for the region and indeed for the world.
Right.
The U.S. is already, in my view, trying to do this. The fact that there are military exercises with Qatar is a very strong signal to Saudi Arabia that the U.S. is not simply walking away from its partner in Qatar. And
All right, and
the likelihood of the U.S. abandoning Saudi Arabia is, I think, completely unlikely.
All right. We only have 25 seconds left for you. Unfortunately, Mr. Farhad, let me ask you, there are so many things going on in the Middle East. You have the U.S. foreign policy, very different in the region. You have the younger generation, the crown prince we just talked about, coming up into the leadership. You also have the world dramatically changing. What kind of Middle East are we looking at and will be looking at in the near future? Very general question, but I need to have your vision, Mr. Farhad.
Well, in less than 25 seconds, as you said, I think it's going to be way more dangerous, unfortunately, than what we saw before during the past 5 years. I think we're heading into a stage of new confrontations in the region, and this is going to result in more chaos in the region, unfortunately.